Okay, guys, I'm super privileged to announce the next speaker. Dr. Andrew M.T. Moore is a 40-year research archaeologist, like royalty, archaeology royalty we have in the building. He's the recent past president of the world's largest association of professional archaeologists. He's legit. Like, we've all been, from time to time, accused of a bit of pseudo-archaeology. There we are. But Dr. Moore is really hard to attack. He's super solid. As the principal investigator of Abu Hereyra in Syria, he made groundbreaking discoveries of the earliest evidence for human civilization and agriculture, as well as the Younger Dryas impact. And we are all wildly privileged to see him in person today and to be able to take home a video of him, because it's really hard to find him on the internet talking. So I'm super excited and totally honored to announce Dr. Andrew M.T. Moore to the stage.
Thank you, Johanna, and good afternoon, everybody. You are a terrific audience, enthusiastic, engaged, and amazingly still awake. Let's see if we can, hold that alertness for the next hour and a quarter. We have an hour and a quarter together. I will be talking for about 45 to 50 minutes, which means we should have 20 minutes for questions at the end. So I encourage you, as you listen to the presentation, see the slides, if there are things that are puzzling you, save them up to the end, and hopefully we'll have enough time to respond to your issues, whatever they may be. Now, this talk is about a key topic in archaeology. So I thought we might begin by asking ourselves, what is the purpose of archaeology? Many people think that it's about digging big holes in the ground. Here you see the deep sounding at the site of in southern Iraq, dug in the 1920s. Others think that archaeologists dig just to recover spectacular artifacts. We were in Egypt just a little while ago. There's a picture, if you like, of Tutankhamun's famous gold coffin. Some people think that archaeologists dig up dinosaurs. No, that's really the job for the paleontologists, who work on much longer time scales than we do. Archaeology is about much more than that. It takes the entire human career from 3 million years ago down to the day before yesterday, and it focuses on artifacts, on things. We archaeologists dig up objects that people have made. That's what the focus of the discipline is. And it might be something like that Acheulean stone axe, that beautiful stone axe on the left of the picture there, which dates back 400,000 years or so. Or it might be a village in which people lived, like Batatakin there in the Navajo National Monument in Arizona. We can take in entire landscapes, because many landscapes across the globe have been seriously modified by people over long periods of time. So that's the landscape around Stonehenge in southern England. You have the great monument there in the foreground, and then if you look to the left towards the horizon, you'll see little bumps on the horizon. Those are barrows or burial mounds that were clearly part of the entire sacred landscape here. This is another example of an archaeological landscape from Petra, the city of Petra in southern Jordan. And we're looking right down on the center of the ancient city there. The major buildings were along the principal road in the center of the picture, and then the entire rest of that basin was filled with buildings, with the remains of fields, all the rest of it. So that's another example of an entire archaeological landscape. So archaeologists then focus on the entire human career, which extends back now, we think, 3 million years. I just have showed the last 1 million years in this image with a Homo habilis from Olduvai Gorge making alder and stone tools, upper left, through the Iron Age, the beginnings of iron tool making. This is supposedly a replica Viking blacksmith, right down to the present. Now, we know that throughout the human career, which covers 3 million years of the ice ages, humans have existed against a background of constantly changing climate. So environmental change is a given for the human story. But those regular environmental changes can be interrupted by natural disasters of one kind or another. I give you 2 examples here from relatively recent moments in time. The one on the left is the explosion of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, actually the year of the Battle of Waterloo, but that's just a coincidence. This blew so much debris into the air that it darkened the skies for 2 years afterwards. The following year, 1816, the harvests across the entire northern hemisphere were wiped out. This was known as the year without a summer. It led to massive famine worldwide, really a global catastrophe. Obviously, the following year, things began to improve, but that in itself wiped out thousands, millions of people across the world. And then the other one I show you is simply the result of Hurricane Katrina, the disaster that struck New Orleans and the Louisiana coast just a few years ago. Most of the population of New Orleans left, and of course many of them did not come back. This is a disaster, a natural disaster in our own time that has had a major impact on one of the great cities of North America, of the US, and from which it is not, and probably never will, fully recover. Just keep those examples in mind as we move forward with our story. So our theme this afternoon is the origins of farming, and I wanted to remind you all, or for us to remind ourselves, about why this is so important. For 2 million years plus, humans roamed the globe as hunters and gatherers, living off the land in very small communities, and on the move fairly regularly throughout the year. With farming came the first settlements, villages, and then towns, and ultimately cities. We see with the first settlements, we see population growth and expansion of population. We see the invention of writing systems, bureaucracy, organized religion, and ultimately, of course, our modern world. I illustrate that with a reconstruction of the ancient city of Babylon, bottom left. You can see there the ziggurat or temple mound of at ancient Ur, also in southern Iraq, and then one of the early cuneiform tablets, that one from the collection in the British Museum. Now, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming began in many centers across the world, but the earliest was in the Middle East. And we call this development, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, the agricultural revolution, because of its consequences, because of the enormous impact it had on our ways of life. So that gives us 2 questions that we're going to talk about this afternoon. When did agriculture begin in the Middle East, and ultimately what caused it? Well, we know that agriculture in the Middle East began right across the Fertile Crescent. That's that beige curve, if you like, in that slide. And on the right-hand side, it goes all the way from the Persian Gulf, along the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, right up to the north, southern Turkey, northern Syria, and then west down the Mediterranean coast. That's the region in which agriculture began. And I'm going to take you to one site in particular in that region, Abu Hereyra on the Euphrates Valley in northern Syria, a site I excavated half a century ago. And yes, I'm still standing. Here we are. And you will want to know why I'm taking you back to a dig that is now half a century old, and we will get to that as part of our story. But it is a really a unique example, a window on the origins of farming in this part of the world, because it has a sequence that's not really matched anywhere else in the Middle East. And you may ask, well, why did we go to the Euphrates Valley? And judging by the look of that slide, you're going to be pondering it for a little while longer. The image that should be there is simply missing. It didn't come through on the internet transmission of the PowerPoint thing. So I'll tell you what should be in that picture. In the 1960s, the Syrian government was building a dam across the Euphrates River. That picture is supposedly of the dam in its completed state. Once the dam was completed, it was going to flood 50 miles of the Euphrates River Valley. This was a part of the world that had hardly been investigated archaeologically before, so nobody knew what we were going to find when we got there. But the Syrians asked me, a 27-year-old graduate student who had some experience in Middle Eastern archaeology, to go and find a site to dig. And so that, of course, I did. That's the kind of invitation that comes once in a professional lifetime. But it was, this was a salvage excavation, but that's what took us to this site, Abu Hereyra, and that's what the site looked like while we were excavating it, an enormous mound rising up above the floodplain of the Euphrates River. And you can see there some of the trenches in the background. You see how widely spaced they were across the mound. I've got some pictures here. I actually had several pictures, but they seem to have disappeared, of our work in the field. We were living in mud brick houses and in tents on the site. The seasons were very long. We started in the summer when it was far too hot, and we finished in the winter when it was far too cold. There was no running water or electricity, so for washing water, we had a mule cart that brought water up from the river for us to wash in. For drinking water, we had to go to where they were building the dam, where there was a water pumping station of purified water that we could use for drinking. We seem to have lost a lot of pictures in this presentation. This is rather unfortunate, but the rest of them look okay. But we're missing this one. But what I wanted to show you in this missing slide is some of the methods that we used. This was a salvage excavation done under great pressure of time. We had two seasons, 1972 and 1973, but we ran it as though it were a research excavation. Thank you. And the reason for that was there's absolutely no point in digging a site like potatoes because you will not recover the information that you need. It's much better to dig a little carefully and have a full record of what it is you're doing than just some sort of scrambled eggs arrangement. So we dug this in full professional mode. That means that all of the soil that we excavated went through sieves, and that was to recover, yes, the artifacts, of course, but also the animal bones, so that we would have a full record of at least that part of the economy. And we then ran flotation machines on an industrial scale in order to recover plant remains that would tell us about the plant side of the ancient economy, because we knew that this site dated at least from the early stages of farming, the early Neolithic. We could tell that from the flints that were on the surface of the mound before we even started to work. So we knew roughly at least what the date of the later stages of occupation on the site were. So we excavated with great care and with full recovery of not only the artifacts but also the organic material. We had a lot of human skeletons as well that have also been the subject of more recent study. And in addition to all of that, we saved some soil samples so that in future, we could go back and look at these soil samples to check some of the information we were getting from the plant remains, the animal bones, and all the rest of it, should we wish to do so. And that turns out to be extremely important in the story that I'm telling today. So here's the timeline for the site. So just focus initially on that beige strip in the middle, because that's the period of occupation of the mound. And you'll see there that, in fact, we were dealing with two superimposed settlements, one called Abu Hereyra I, all right, and then on top of it, Abu Hereyra II, with an intermediate phase in between, Abu Hereyra I and Abu Hereyra II. Abu Hereyra I was occupied at the tail end of the Pleistocene, at the end of the last ice age. Abu Hereyra II in the early Holocene. So we knew straight away, once we had the radiocarbon dates, that we were dealing with a major environmental transition from the end of the last ice age into more modern climatic conditions. So that was, point number one. The second is, if you look at that timeline above the Abu Hereyra I, Abu Hereyra II strip, you'll see we're starting in the Berling-Allerud climate phase. That's right at the end, or very near the end of the last ice age, when the climate was warming up and open forest was spreading across much of the Middle East. And then you'll see the Younger Dryas kicks in. Okay? All of this happening during the Abu Hereyra I occupation. And then as we get into Abu Hereyra II, we're in the Holocene with a return to more contemporary climatic and vegetation conditions. But the point to notice here is not only are we dealing with an environmental transition, the site was occupied over an incredibly long period of time, 6,000 to 7,000 years, something like that. And that's highly unusual for a prehistoric site anywhere in the world, let alone in the Middle East. Now, you've heard a lot about drones. This dig was done 50 years ago, well before drones had been heard of. So this picture was taken using a kite. That's the sort of old-fashioned way of taking aerial photographs in the Middle East, but it gave us a very good image all the same. And what you're looking at there is the sort of trapezoid which represents the site. It actually extends into the floodplain of the river. We were living in the village, which is mostly out of sight to the top left of the picture. But I'm going to, all those pimples, you may wonder what all those pimples are on the site itself. They're the graveyard of the modern village, because very sensibly, the villagers dug their graves in the soft soil, relatively soft soil, of the ancient mound, rather than in the hard marls and rock of the underlying subsoil. Now, we're going to focus this discussion on just one of the trenches that we excavated, Trench E, in the northwest corner of the site, and I've indicated that for you there. Oops, let's go one more. There we go. And this is what Trench E looked like by the time that we had finished excavating. And in most of the image there, what you're looking at is pits dug into the subsoil, okay? You can see that clearly. And those pits are actually they're like rooms. They form parts of pit dwellings that had several rooms in them. And that is the typical dwelling, if you like, that the initial settlers of Abu Hereyra, the first people to come here, made for themselves. They dug these pits into the subsoil to make these pit dwellings. These were semi-subterranean huts. So that was the initial settlement of Abu Hereyra I. Much later on in Abu Hereyra II, they were building mud brick houses, rectangular houses, and that's you see part of one of those there in the upper part of the picture. Now, there was enough information. Oh, no, there was one other thing I want to show you there. If you look at the bottom third of the pit dwellings there, you'll see that the subsoil is partly black and partly red. Do you get that? Do you see that? Is that coming through in the image? Okay. That was an indication that the subsoil there had been heavily burned. Keep that image in mind because we're going to come back to it. It's very important. Now, there was enough information in that image in what we were digging up to produce this reconstruction drawing of what that pit dwelling looked like. And here you can see the several rooms. There's a grinding stone in the bottom of one of them that we found in situ. And there in that burned area, you know, when it came time to do this drawing, I had to sort of think through, what did that burned area represent? It was right outside the front door. The most obvious thing was that it represented the remains of cooking fires. So that's the way we reconstructed this part of the settlement for this drawing. We put that in as basically the remains of cooking fires. And then you see the dwellings themselves are made of timber and reeds, all materials that were readily available in the floodplain, on the floodplain of the Euphrates River. Now, these people, when they arrived at Abu Hereyra and created this initial settlement, were themselves hunters and gatherers who were just becoming sedentary, who were just beginning to settle down. So for plants, they had an abundance of wild plants in the river valley, like the rhizomes of these reeds here, which are very good source of food in the winter. There were other plants growing out in the open forest behind, very, very different landscape from that of the present day. And then every spring, very obligingly, large herds of gazelle came through past Abu Hereyra on a traditional migration route. So they were able to go out, construct these animal traps, and then kill off large numbers of gazelle. They dried the meat and used it for consumption later in the year. So they were hunters and gatherers. The very first people who came here were hunters and gatherers, amongst the last hunters and gatherers in the Middle East. Now, that was about 13,500 years ago or so. And then something happened. Very rapidly, there was a change in vegetation from this open woodland that you see on the left there to a dry, arid, cold steppe. And we were able to tell we could see this change taking place from the plant remains that we had so carefully recovered using large-scale flotation. It was very clear from the plant remains that this vegetation change had taken place. And that's what this illustration of the changing vegetation is based on. The other thing that we could tell was that this change had happened extremely rapidly, perhaps in a single lifetime. Our radiocarbon dates by the mid-80s, early 90s were good enough for us to pin this down and to say this had happened a little after 13,000 years ago. So we'd had 500 years of hunting and gathering, maybe 600, and then as we got into the next millennium, very suddenly we had a change in vegetation, and it seemed to have happened remarkably quickly. Now, with that information, with the evidence for vegetation change, knowing that we were towards the end of the Pleistocene, and with a very good radiocarbon dates, we were able to tie what we had found, the evidence we had found at Abu Hereyra, into the Greenland ice core sequence, which itself is incredibly detailed and gives us a very accurate rendering of all those climate changes towards the end of the last glaciation into a more modern period. And there you see the techniques that are used to extract these cores in Greenland, and they then get published in the scientific literature, and we can then use that information to tie into our record. And it was very clear that what we were looking at then was an expression in the Middle East of something known as the Younger Dryas, which you've been hearing about non-stop for the last day and a half or so. So towards the end of the last ice age, things had been getting warmer, moister, more forested, all the rest of it. And then in the Middle East, just like in other parts of the world, across mainly the northern hemisphere, to some extent in the south, there was this very rapid return to basically glacial conditions, cold, dry conditions, more representative of the last glaciation. And you see it's like falling off a cliff when you look at these diagrams of climate change taken from the ice cores. And we now know that, or at least ever since the 1980s, we've known that probably what caused the Younger Dryas in the first place was a huge chunk of the North American, the Laurentide ice sheet breaking off and falling into the North Atlantic and shutting down what we think of today as the normal Gulf Stream circulation of ocean water, bringing warm water into much more northerly latitudes, and that governs a lot of the climate in Eurasia and beyond. So we knew about the Younger Dryas. We had some sense of where it fitted in. We were able to tie our vegetation changes into this global phenomenon, but neither we nor anybody else had really thought at all about what caused the Laurentide ice sheet to disintegrate in the first place. And we will come back to that later on. And then what we saw at Abu Hereyra was, in phase 1b, that's immediately after the onset of the Younger Dryas, our people stayed. They didn't go away, they stayed. But they had to change their way of life. The old pattern of hunting and gathering in this relatively lush environment wouldn't do anymore. The gazelles still showed up, so the meat supply, for the most part, was taken care of. But all the plants, or many of the plants, which they had depended on in the wild form, simply weren't there anymore. So what they did was to turn to farming. And that's what you see the beginnings of in this image. Amongst the first crops that they raised was domestic rye. And you see some pictures there of the actual rye grains that we dug up and then dated. And it turned out they came in a little after 12,800 years ago. So we know that this was one of the early crops that they were cultivating. Here's some the other crops that they got into by Abu Hereyra 2 times. They were into wheat and barley, peas, beans, chickpeas or garbanzo beans, a whole array of things that included both cereals and legumes, so that this was a balanced crop regime. That really represented the initial stages of a mixed farming economy in this part of the world that, of course, was to spread more widely later on. And then they got into domestic animals, sheep and goat first, and then later on cattle and pigs, as you see there. So in Abu Hereyra 2 times, the settlement was huge, much, much bigger. It had 6,000 to 8,000 people, we think, living in it, in houses like this little rectangular mud brick house, an individual house, you see, on its own, surrounded by open courtyards. And there was enough information, again, from the excavation to do a reconstruction drawing. Here you see the house itself. A lot of the rooms were pretty small, so a lot of the activities took place out of doors, but you see a woman there grinding away at grain to prepare the daily bread. We found those grinding stones in the houses. People buried their dead under the floors, and you see the graves there in that reconstruction drawing. And by 9,000 years or so ago, we were able to present to the world an image of this settlement now of mixed farmers practicing a mixed farming regime, a very large settlement indeed, until the thing began to shrink a bit. There were further climate changes. And we move on into the later Neolithic and a different world. But that was the basic story that we were able to recover from Abu Hereyra and that we published in this book in the year 2000, 23 years ago. So that was the story up till then, but we still had plenty of material to work on. So although we published a pretty full account, of which I've just given you a synopsis, there was a lot more to do. And of course, I'm still working on that, now. But it left a number of questions unanswered, and we're now going to turn to those and see where they take us. So in 2007, a group of geologists, this time, Firestone and the others, published this earthquake-like paper in the scientific literature claiming that the Younger Dryas, in fact, was caused by a comet or asteroid or something, some extraterrestrial object colliding with the Earth and causing climatic mayhem. Well, you know, interesting stuff, fascinating stuff, controversial stuff. But then one of the members of that team, Doug Kennett, and his father, Jim Kennett, came to me a few years after that, so just a number of years ago now, 10, 15 years ago, and said, Andrew, Abu Hereyra was actually occupied during the Younger Dryas, wasn't it? And I said, yes, Doug, it was. Well, do you have any soil samples left from precisely that moment when the Younger Dryas kicked in? I said, Doug, I dug this site, this was then, 40 years ago. I'm not at all sure, but, you know, because you are you, I will go and look. And I was keeping these samples in my garage at that point in the way that we archaeologists do. And I rummaged around in my garage and I found some key soil samples that are essential to this, this story. There were other soil samples that we had collected that were then safely in the Aleppo Museum, alas, no longer safe, probably destroyed, but also duplicate samples which were preserved in London. And they turn out to have an important part to say in this story also. How did I know Doug Kennett? Well, it turns out his wife is working with me on another project in Croatia this time. That's how, you know, this interconnected world of science and archaeology works. You so often end up working with colleagues who are also personal friends. It's one of the rich aspects of this life that we lead. Okay, so in this image that's in front of you, you're looking at a profile drawing of, guess what, Trench E. And down the left-hand side of that column is the series of soil samples that we took. And you see most of them are clearly derived from building material, the mud, that had been brought up by the inhabitants of Abu Hereyra 1 and Abu Hereyra 2 to use as building material on the site. And they all look just sort of muddy brown, except one sample in particular, which is nearly jet black. And that comes from the transition deposit between Abu Hereyra 1A and 1B, between the hunters and gatherers and the first farmers. And you can see it's the deposit that sort of fills in those pit dwellings at the very bottom of the trench there. Now, when Doug and his colleagues, Alan West and the rest of them, took these soil samples, and there really wasn't that much to go with, and put it under the microscope and then the electronic microscope, things started to pop out. And so they found straight away that we had significant concentrations of these rare minerals, platinum, iridium, zircon, and all the rest of it, and very importantly, traces of melt glass. So what had happened was that something had heated the subsoil to 2,000 degrees plus centigrade, had melted it, turned it into molten glass, and had splattered it on bits of building material, bits of animal bones, anything that was sort of lying around in the bottom of the settlement on the ground level at the time that this catastrophe happened. And there you see a little fragment of animal bone splattered with bits of melt glass. And just to be sure, Doug ran another radiocarbon date that came in at 12,800 years ago once you calibrated the date. We already had, you know, perfectly good dates, but this was an extra one just to be sure. So we were able to pin down this moment at which this event happened, devastating event happened at Abu Hereyra, to the onset of the Younger Dryas, this sort of magical 12,800 years ago date. Now there's some more evidence here of precisely this kind of thing. Another piece of animal bone in blue in this picture, because that allows you to see more clearly what's going on, and you can see more splattered melt glass on that. Bottom right, there are some of these carbon spherules that also form as organic material goes up in smoke. And then rather interestingly on the left, You've got bits of the reeds that were used as building materials in those pit dwellings, preserved forever in melt glass impressions. So what on earth was going on here? Well, we know now that the Earth, 12,800 years ago, met a disintegrating comet that exploded in fragments all across the northern hemisphere and to some extent in the southern hemisphere as well, creating fires everywhere. And it turned out that one fragment of this disintegrating thing exploded just a kilometer or two from Abu Hereyra and wiped out the village. And it was this and the accompanying changes in climate that caused the vegetation change that we all already knew about and seems to have triggered the shift towards farming on the part of the inhabitants. Their world had gone up in smoke. If they were to stay there, they had to change their way of life in order to accommodate the new circumstances. So let's go back now and look at some of the slides that I still have of the original excavation and see if we can pick up from the visual record of what we were digging elements of this explosion. So that's what Trench E looked like before we completely excavated those pit dwellings at the very bottom. So the pit dwellings were the very first phase, 1A, and it was that settlement that was destroyed by the disintegrating comet, and then they built rather different dwellings thereafter. You can see, particularly in the bottom half of that image, that the soil is really very black indeed, and that's where the soil sample that has given us most of the information actually came from. Now, in this composite image, you've got on the left-hand side pictures of the pit dwellings as we dug them, and then on the right-hand side, we've just dug a little bit more into that black soil, and you can see how it's filling the pits, okay? And you can see the burned subsoil just beginning to show itself in that image. We'll skip the next one because that clearly hasn't come through. This is a close-up of one of the pits. And I want you to focus very carefully on this image because it's important. When I came up with this explanation for the black burn level and said it was campfires, and for the reddening of the subsoil underneath, you know, back in the 1980s, 1990s, that sounded pretty good. Why would it be anything else? Well, there was just one nagging thing at the back of my mind. It was very clear that the burning had extended right down into the pits. You can see in this image that the reddening is not just on the surface around the pits, it actually goes right down into the pits and into the bottom. Can you see that? Yeah, okay. So that was an indication which I really missed. It was in the back of my mind, but I didn't put two and two together, that something much hotter had happened. Something much more devastating, and of course it turns out now we can see that this is the impact of the comet exploding nearby, not only incinerating the village, but generating such enormous heat that it burned the subsoil, and that's of course where the melt glass came from. So the airburst in northern Syria 12,800 years ago would have looked something like this as it tore across the sky. As it exploded, it destroyed the village, and everybody in it. That image, that reconstruction image there is obviously just of what it would have looked like to people in the village a few seconds before they went up in smoke. We now know that this was a global phenomenon. We used to think that this happened just in the northern hemisphere. This shows you some of the locations in which this spike in platinum has turned up in sediments from geological and archaeological sites right across the northern hemisphere. But also now, as you'll see in that picture, from research that's been published in the last 3 or 4 years, from sites in the southern hemisphere too, one in Chile and one in South Africa. So what were the consequences at Abu Hereyra? Well, the very important point to remember is that people came back. They refounded the settlement almost immediately afterwards. We had that from the radiocarbon dates, which are in a continuous sequence. They document continued occupation at the site, and there was no change in the artifacts. The artifacts before and after the comet explosion were just about the same, apparently made by more or less the same people. Not everyone was at the site, clearly, on the day it went up in smoke. They must have been away on hunting and gathering expeditions kilometers away, and they escaped this inferno. And they either came back immediately afterwards, or at least within a decade or two. It can't have been much longer than that. They refounded the settlement, this time as an above-ground village of huts sitting on the ground, not in the ground. And they immediately began to change their economy. I've shown you the evidence for the domestic rye grains. They started cultivating domestic rye. Well, we now know, as a result of research that's currently underway, we published a bit of it last year, and there's more still to come, that they were already starting to pen sheep. Where does the evidence for that come? Well, it comes from animal dung. In those flotation samples we collected 50 years ago, it turns out amongst all the seeds and the other stuff in the dust surrounding these things that we have saved very carefully for half a century now, there are traces of animal dung. And they contain spherolites, which are very distinctive of animal dung. And it's clear, therefore, that these people were penning animals on the site. There's none in 1A, the hunting and gathering phase. It kicks in 1B, and then we find these spherolites throughout the rest of the sequence. So as one of their other responses to the onset of the changed environmental circumstances was that they got into penning animals. And as a result of another research inquiry that's going on at the moment, where we've been looking at stanols, which are another component of animal dung, we've been able to pin them down to species. We now know it's sheep. So that manuscript is in prep, and hopefully will see the light of day in the next few months. So what we've got here then is evidence that they not only got into arable agriculture, they got into essentially the domestication of animals at the same time. That's the full mixed farming economy that emerged from the Middle East and spread across the world thousands of years later. But our people at Abu Hereyra were already doing both things, raising crops and raising domestic animals, combined with some continued hunting and gathering in this new Younger Dryas post-catastrophe world. So the Younger Dryas was a huge event that had a colossal impact worldwide. We now know that it was caused by this cosmic collision 12,800 years ago, and part of that phenomenon, as part of that phenomenon, an airburst destroyed the village of, the hunter-gatherer village of Abu Hereyra, but immediately after, people swallowed hard, the ones that survived, and people came back, they reconfigured their existence and decided this was still a good place to be, but they transformed the economy and indeed changed their mode of living. And built a new community there that was to survive for several thousand more years to come. So they were the ones who, amongst no doubt others in the region, got into mixed farming early on, and it's that form of life, that way of life, that many years later, having established itself across Western Asia, spread into Europe, Central Asia, and North Africa. Thank you. Or shukran, as we say in Arabic. So we do have time for questions. If you'd like to come up, I gather there are two microphones, one there and one over there. And if you've got questions, we'll alternate from one microphone to the other and make good use of the time that we have available. Please.
Hello.
Yep.
I guess I have to put my face closer to the mic. I'm Tom, and good presentation, very informative. This is the first time I've heard about Abu. I can't even say it, but
sorry, Abu Hereyra. Never mind.
Anyway, So you said that after the event that they came back within a decade and they domesticated grains. So my question is, how would you go within a decade or less from hunter-gatherer to suddenly realizing, hey, we should grow these specific types of grains and legumes and things like that? I mean, that seems to be a pretty dramatic shift in a very short amount of time.
Yes, it was. And thank you for that, carefully thought through question. But the point to remember is that these people were very experienced plantsmen and botanists. They had been working with these plants as wild plants for hundreds, thousands of years before. This was common knowledge, I think, in the region. And while we have we have all of these data from Abu Hereyra that allow us to document these different stages of the transition in great detail and pin them down chronologically. There must have been other sites elsewhere in the Fertile Crescent where something like this was going on also, but which either haven't been excavated or they haven't saved the material, perhaps in the way that we did. But I think what they were doing was basically working on prior knowledge. It's not, I would never claim that our people invented agriculture. I think that other people had been experimenting with this for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years before that. We have some evidence from Israel that people were doing this several thousand years before, but not in a consistent way that would enable them to build a whole economy on it. So I think they were using existing knowledge and turning to it when the need arose. And so it was a crisis situation. They had the knowledge. They realized they would have to make a shift of some sort. But it was not just growing crops and keeping some animals. They were still doing some hunting and gathering. So it was a blended economy. And it took quite a while for agriculture to become really the sort of dominant thing. But of course, when they started doing this, they cannot have understood or anticipated that it would take them over in the way that it did, because once you get into farming, there's no going back. It's a one-way trip. Thank you. Question over here.
Right, this is from the live stream, from someone called Custom Breeds. He says, is the reed that you mentioned as a food source Phragmites australis?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, and it has these rhizomes.
There it is.
that you can eat in the winter. They're a very good winter food when there's not much else that's out there. And then obviously you can use the bit above the water as building material. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Question over here.
Yes, in the seeds that you said you recovered,
Yep.
Did you notice an improvement in the quality of what they produced, their crops, if they produced, and also if these cataclysmic things had anything to do with an increase in production, and if they had figured out any kind of fertilizer? Were they using anything like that, or when you saw that start, or
Okay.
if they did? So.
Yes, we did see an improvement in productivity over time, but over hundreds and thousands of years. So later in Abu Hereyra 2 times, the crops were a lot more productive than the ones that they initially domesticated. But that's a matter of husbandry and selection over a long period of time for ever more productive yields. You ask about the manuring, but this is a point that I didn't mention, and so thank you for raising it. One of the things that's so important about a mixed farming economy where you have crops and animals is that you can pasture the animals on the stubble of the crops, and their dung will act as a natural fertilizer. So the system is self-reinforcing, okay? That's why it's so important to have the crops and the animals together. We used to think that it was crops first, animals second, but that left out the manuring bit. How were you going to keep the crops fertile? The only way you could do that was by a long fallow system. What we now have, as a result of this new research, is evidence that they were using, they had the capacity to manure these crops from the very beginning. And that's a very important new concept. Thank you. Next, over here.
Good afternoon. I was wondering what sort of features of the site do you think led to the continued existence of people on the site for so many thousands of years?
Okay, I think it was all to do with the location. of Abu Hereyra. So as you saw from the photographs, this site was right on the edge of the sort of dry land before you got into the muddy Euphrates floodplain. So it was actually on that ecotone between the floodplain, which was highly productive for hunters and gatherers, and later would provide fields for cultivators, and what started out as open woodland and is now a rather barren steppe, though with irrigation you can do things there. So that gave the inhabitants access to 2 environmental zones. That was one thing. And the other Neolithic sites that have been found up and down the Euphrates Valley tend to be in the same location. The second thing was, and this we got from the animal bones, was that the site was located on, or very close to, this gazelle migration route, which has been documented historically by ethnographers. But it was those animals coming up or coming close to the river valley and into northern Syria every spring, in enormous quantities in prehistoric times. That was the key thing about, the key extra element about the location, why people wanted to come back there, because the gazelle were clearly still migrating. The dry, cool conditions of the younger Dryas don't seem to have knocked the gazelle populations back. They kept on coming for another couple of thousand years. And so that was the other element in the location that was so important.
Thank you.
Over here.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm familiar with what people say about as agriculture spread through the Middle East, that people shrunk by about 25 centimeters on average. Did you see any evidence of that happening prior to the Younger Dryas onset?
We have no skeletons, alas, from Abu Hereyra 1, so we don't really know what stature the people had. I do have plenty of skeletons from Abu Hereyra 2, all those bodies buried under the house floors, and there we don't see any change in stature at all. For the most part, people in this early phase of the agricultural revolution seem to have been relatively well fed. If they got through childhood, and the key thing is the weaning date, it's when they start to, when you wean babies and they become little children, they go around picking things up, dirty things, putting them in their mouths, and that's just not good. But if you get through that, then they would live to 40, 50, 60 years old. We have plenty of examples of people of what would have been before the advent of antibiotics, would have been a perfectly respectable age to live. They were relatively well nourished on this mixed farming economy, with the addition of some wild products. So no change in stature once agriculture had kicked in. Over here.
First off, I'd just like to thank you for taking out the time to be here and for all your research. I really like it. You made the statement that once they switched to farming and agriculture, they couldn't go back to hunting. I'm wondering, once they spent a few decades farming and the animals had time to repopulate their numbers, when there were bad seasons, instead of going hungry, why they couldn't switch back to farming? Why instead, there's evidence that they were malnourished and, disease started?
I think that the key thing is what happens to human populations when they settle down in a village. And immediately you find that the time between births shortens, okay? And populations grow very rapidly. The other thing is, the moment you get into agriculture, you have new weaning foods. So you maybe have milk from those sheep that you can give to the children, and that means mum can have another baby much quicker than she otherwise would have done if she were a hunter and gatherer lady walking across the landscape. So we see populations grow very rapidly among settled hunters and gatherers, and even more so when they get into farming. And these new foods provide particularly good food for young children. You can take the new rye grains and the new wheat grains and so on, heat them up and turn them into mush, and that's very good. That sort of porridge is very good weaning food for children. So you have new dietary options there that replace some of the things that you might might have used as a hunter and gatherer. And once you're into that system with populations, steadily growing, and you're cultivating more and more crops in ever wider dispersed fields, the whole thing becomes self-reinforcing. It's near impossible to go back at that stage.
Thank you very much.
Next one.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the movement from subterranean housing to above ground housing. And what about moving to an agricultural society, or what major changes would have motivated that?
That's a little difficult to answer. Perhaps, the basic question is, why did they dig pit houses in the first place? And again, that's not completely clear. What I can say is that a pit house in the summer in the Euphrates Valley, where it's darn hot, gives you some, it moderates the temperature just a little bit. It means that you're, by digging into the ground, you're providing yourself with a dwelling that, at ground level and below ground level gives you a little bit of sort of cooler space in the summer months. But when you get into mud brick houses, you see that on a much bigger scale. Mud brick houses in the present day in that part of the world, we were living in them, have fairly thick walls, thicker actually than the ones that we were digging up, and they're oriented northwest, southeast. And the reason for that is that the bricks, the solid bricks, really do moderate the climate. It's much cooler inside than outside. The other thing is it's darn cold there in the winter. We were camping in tents. All that river water we were using to wash in would freeze over at night in the tents in December. That's not much fun if you, like me, like to shave every day. But in winter, a mud brick house that's aligned like that is set up so that it receives maximum winter sun. So that keeps the house a little bit warmer in the winter than it otherwise would be. So while we don't have, I think, a full understanding of why they made these different architectural transitions, we can identify some of the factors that seem to have governed their choice of building materials and then the kinds of dwellings that they came up with. Next one.
Thank you. I have two questions. One was, is it right to assume that the whole population was destroyed, and then who repopulated the place? And the second one is, with the new inhabitants, were you able to find any indications of the soil degradation or even improvement with their agricultural practices?
Let's take the first one first. So, the replacement population. I just have to assume that it's well. First, were they all wiped out? Well, they must have been. Anyone who was in or near that site that day was wiped out, no question. This was a devastating event. The temperatures were simply too great. This was, like a huge bomb exploding over the village. Everything within reach was wiped out. However, we think that these air bursts, the impact didn't spread that far, maybe, a kilometer or two at most. And anything beyond that would have been still alive when the event was over. They might have burst their eardrums, but they would still be around. So if somebody was a few kilometers away, they could have come back straight away. Probably more likely is that it took, a few years for people to come back. It's a supposition on my part that it's people who were closely related to the original villagers who came back. But I just look at the artifacts and I see absolutely no discontinuity at all between Phase 1A and Phase 1B. They were using exactly the same flint tools, the same grinding tools, everything. Nothing there had changed. The only thing that had changed was the economy. That's a big deal. And they decided that now the pits were filled in. They weren't going to dig pits anymore. They would construct new huts on top of the now buried pits. So that's a supposition, but I think it's a reasonable inference based on the evidence that we have. Then on the nature of the soil, we were excavating on the site, not off it. So that's an unanswerable question. The other point to make perhaps is that this is a very altered landscape. This part of the Middle East has been subject to massive erosion over thousands upon thousands of years. And so it just doesn't look like it did at the end of the Pleistocene. It's not only the vegetation that is completely different, it's gone, but any soils that might have been in place around Abu Hereyra 12,000, 13,000 years ago have simply blown away, into the Euphrates River and down into the Persian Gulf. So we're not dealing with the same landscape, and therefore it's impossible, I'm afraid, to investigate, for instance, soil profiles and all the rest of it in the immediate vicinity of the site.
Thanks for your thoughtful
So my
response.
question has to do with the temperature. It's generally known that when they had the Younger Dryas, the temperature dropped extremely. And I was wondering if that happened in this area, or if there's let's say the northern hemisphere is cold, and where you are, it remained temperate, so that people are able to survive. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Okay. We are very dependent on things like the Greenland ice cores and indeed the pollen cores to sort of reinforce the evidence that we have from our own observations of the vegetation changes to get some handle on what we're dealing with here temperature-wise. The general in the literature, the sort of general statement is that temperatures dropped about 6 degrees centigrade, mean average, through the time of the Younger Dryas, globally. It's possible that in the southern part of the Middle East, the temperature drop wasn't quite so sharp as that, but for the pollen diagrams that we have for northern Syria, the Zagros Mountains, there's one in eastern Greece that is very detailed that a lot of us turn to. It's pretty clear that the vegetation changes we saw at Abu Hereyra, open woodland to dry, cold steppe, and you can see the species of plants and see what sort of temperatures they would tolerate. The cold, dry steppe of the Younger Dryas around Abu Hereyra was very similar to the sort of conditions you find in Kazakhstan today, very similarly dry and cold with ferocious winters. I don't think the winters on the Euphrates were that bad, but clearly there was a very significant drop in temperature, and the 6-degree figure doesn't seem at all outlandish to me. That seems to me, roughly right. Our evidence is consonant with that.
Would that affect what they planted, the choice of plants?
Yes, it would, and also where they planted. So if the area, the sort of dry land out of the valley is now bone-dry steppe, and we're not seriously into irrigation yet, their fields must have been in the valley bottom. They must have been into clearing away the now burned up jungle that would have been characteristic of the valley bottom. There are also there's one wadi in particular, one side valley that comes into the Euphrates, just where Abu Hereyra is. I didn't mention that in response to the question about the location of the site. And that would have provided a degree of natural irrigation at a slightly higher level than the Euphrates floodplain, and I think some of the cultivation probably went on there. So again, it was this element of access to the Euphrates floodplain plus this side valley coming in that enabled agriculture to get a hold at such an early date.
So was that consistent pretty much throughout that whole band around the globe?
Climatically, yes.
Okay.
It's going to express itself vegetationally somewhat differently as you go from place to place.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
As a modern person, I'm listening to your presentation, and thank you very much for it. And I'm looking for something that looks familiar. Things that are missing are, where are the tools? Where are the clothing? Where are the toys? Knuckle bones from the sheep can be toys. Did you find anything like that?
Remarkably little. And so there, I think, let me tell you what we did find, and then we'll think a little bit about what we didn't find. So enormous quantities of flint tools. And I didn't get into the material culture particularly today, but tons and tons of flint tools, which I'm still working through. So, that was the most common single artifact, flint tools for doing every conceivable kind of activity. Grinding stones, mostly used for preparing food, but also for preparing pigments. We would find little bits of red ochre in the bottoms of hollow grinding stones, and so on. A little bit of obsidian from eastern Anatolia, indicating long-distance trade. A few cowrie shells from the Mediterranean or the Red Sea, indicating also long-distance trade and contact with peoples over a fairly wide area. These are the kinds of things we found. A little bit of bitumen that was clearly used to line baskets. We didn't find the baskets because they'd all decayed away, but you would find the bitumen lining of the baskets because there are bitumen seeps along the Euphrates River, and they used the bitumen to line the baskets, and that retained the impressions of the reeds from which the baskets had been made. So an enormous element of the manufactured environment, if you like, of the artifacts is simply gone. So no, wooden objects. The basketry largely gone. Some bone tools, they survived. Bone tools, things like needles and so forth, which indicated fairly clearly that they were making yarn and cloth for clothing. I think they were clothing themselves in textiles, not just in skins, though they certainly would have had plenty of them. But there is an enormous amount of the sort of material remains that in that kind of village simply decay over the years and are not there for the archaeologists to recover. It's a matter of enormous regret. So somebody like me, I spend quite a bit of time in ethnographic museums trying to sort of work out what raw materials they would have had to work with, and therefore what implements they could have made to conduct the lives that they were obviously leading. So there is, in every excavation, there's always going to be a big chunk of stuff that would represent some of the aspects of life that you mentioned that are simply not there for us to recover, but we can put back at least on a hypothetical basis and say they must have had this, they must have had that, they must have had the other. But that's, archaeology is you work with what you've got and you try to reasonably infer the rest, but you can never build a complete picture of what lives were like in the past. That's beyond us. Thank you.
I've got another question from the live stream from Stephen Tasker. He says, is there any evidence to indicate how they would calculate the sowing and the harvesting times?
Yes, there is. And what we rely on there is very good ethnographic studies done by my late colleague and friend Gordon Hillman, who was the archaeobotanist for the project, who'd done extensive work with simple farmers, mainly in eastern Turkey, who still grow a little bit, exactly the same crops that we were digging up the ancestors of at Abu Hereyra. And he has worked out, the seasons in which you plant these things. So most of the cereals were planted in the fall for harvesting the following summer, winter wheat and all the rest of it. The legumes, for the most part, were planted in the spring. And we've been able, using that information, and then studies of the animal bones, and particularly the teeth of the animal bones, the teeth of the gazelle and so on, to work out season by season what people were doing. So the planting season was in the fall. You would be lambing in the very early spring, perhaps as early as December. Then in the very early spring, you would be weeding and protecting your crops from all the predators through the spring. Harvest comes quite early, June, July in that part of the world. And if you're going to have any leisure time in your year at all, it's going to be sort of late July, August, September. And early October, the rains kick in, and the moment you've had one or two rains, the soil is then soft enough for you to get out with your digging sticks or whatever it is you're going to use to begin to prepare the fields for the next round of sowing. So we were able to reconstruct in a fair degree of detail the agricultural year, the year the yearly cycle, first for the hunters and gatherers, then for the earliest farmers, and then later on for the more mature farming system of Abu Hereyra 2B and 2C. Next question.
Yes, sir. I noticed on a map that Abu Hereyra is about 250 miles due northeast of Dr. Collins' site of Tel Haman. Could this have been the same event, or at least something that happened, the same object that broke apart at the same time in that area? Thank you.
No, it's not. These two events are clearly separated by several thousand years. He has an excellent dated chronology for his event. We have a pretty good one for ours, and there are thousands of years in between the two. What, however, those two events do is not to say that somehow or other the Middle East was selected for these cosmic events. It was not. What it's telling us is that these things happen much more frequently in the past than we realized until just a few years ago, and prehistoric and historic settlements were not immune. They too could be destroyed as a result of this. And the lesson for all of you to take away from that observation is that we now live in a hugely populated world with settlements absolutely everywhere. And the next time this happens, if it happens to one of the cities in which many of us live, all hell is going to break loose. Think of Tunguska in Siberia, the last big event back in 1908. That happened in a conifer forest, a pine forest, over a huge area. Well, of course, now Siberia's got more people in it. And if that happened again, the likelihood that a settlement would be involved is pretty high. We need to think about this kind of event as being something that can happen. It can happen at very short notice, and it's going to have much more devastating effects next time than it did in the prehistoric past. That's one of the lessons to take away from all of this. Please. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. I'm forgetting which is which.
I've got three.
Right?
Number one, what did this event do to the water, like the sea levels? How was that affected? Number two, it looks like to me that, like, if there's a temple and it gets destructed, they'll build on top of the temple. So is that a magnetic thread that they're building through? And was it more convenient for them to build on top of the old? Okay, and then number third, and most importantly, I come from cemetery death care. They buried the people in their homes. Did that mean that they had an expectation of afterlife? Okay, so that's that. Thank you so very much.
Hold on, wait a minute. Let's take these in one at a time. But you may have to remind me which is which. Okay, so sea levels. All right, so during the Younger Dryas, it turned cold and dry, and the glaciers began to rebuild. We're talking about a 1,500-year period at most. There are some indications not only that the glaciers started to get a little bit bigger, but that sea levels dropped just a little bit. So it did have a noticeable impact on sea levels. As the water came out of the sea and went back into the glaciers, so sea level went down just a bit. So that's question number one.
Like the impact, like boom,
Oh, no,
boom.
no, it wasn't that. It was all to do with rainwater coming out of the sea, okay, depositing itself on the glaciers, freezing, and turning into ice again. Okay? No, you're not happy about that. Okay.
I'm also thinking about salt.
That when moisture evaporates from the ocean, it leaves the salt behind and becomes fresh water, moves over the land, onto the glaciers, freezes, and the glaciers build up a little bit. Okay?
Got it.
Right. Okay. Next one. Rebuilding temples one on top of another. If a spot is sacred to a community before a catastrophe, and then they're able to come back again to the same settlement and rebuild, the odds are that place is going to be sacred for them when they come back. And so that's the natural place they will go to rebuild another temple. And there's plenty of evidence for that in the archaeological record. At Abu Hereyra, we're not really dealing with temples. We're dealing with, this being a very good place to found a village. And so, if all of those things are still in place, then village Abu Hereyra 2 gets built on exactly the same spot as Abu Hereyra 1. It gets much bigger, it covers it, extends over a much larger area, but that still is a primo place to live. But the pattern is of a very densely clustered village, and that's just typical of the whole Middle East, and for that matter, the Mediterranean going in one direction and into Central Asia in the other.
More of like a commune type
Yes, a little bit,
Okay.
yeah. And then the last one was?
Burials.
Burials,
And
yes,
also,
okay.
Did you note, was there any prep in the burial, or is that something you would know?
Oh, yeah. So, we've got a whole lot of stuff here. So we'll keep it short and sweet. So, beginning in Abu Hereyra 2, maybe it went back into Abu Hereyra 1, but I don't have the data. In Abu Hereyra 2, what happened was when you died, you would probably be put in a special place for your flesh to decay. A little room at the end of a house that served as a charnel room for a little district in the settlement. And after 6-9 months, when things had sort of settled down a bit, what remained of you would be put into a cloth bag and then buried under the floor of your original home. And we think that the ideology that lay behind this was a reverence for ancestors and certainly a belief in the afterlife. And we've been able to document every one of those stages from the human remains we found, and also, from the excavation. We found a charnel room with bodies still in it. So we do know what the process of dealing with the dead was like. There are more women under the floors of the houses than there are men, indicating perhaps a stronger connection between women and the house and home than the men, who must have been buried somewhere else, for the most part. Whatever. And there's this strong indication of a belief in the afterlife, otherwise you wouldn't do this kind of stuff. And that the ancestors were still with you to some extent. Fascinating stuff, not getting a little bit beyond where we are now. How are we doing for time?
I'm afraid we are going to
We're out
have
of
to
time.
cut it off there because we need to make sure that everyone gets a decent break before our penultimate speaker. But thank you so much. I had no idea they put Grandma under the floorboards. That's really freaky. But give it up for Dr. Moore.